Don't worry, I'm just starting, it's no problem at all. I wanted to give a talk today that was a little bit more positive, because a lot of the time I spend diagnosing in great detail what's not working to conserve the world's forests. But in talking about that, I also wanted to give a vision of some positive stories and what does work. So hence we're going to end with, I think, a more inspiring look at some not modern ideas that are actually probably in the future. Is everything okay?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Sorry, I have no animations now because it's on PDF, so there might be text heavy sections, but that's fine. I just wanted to start by telling you the messages that I'm going to give throughout the talk all at once up front, and that way you kind of know where I'm going. So the first points I'm going to make are just about why forests, especially tropical forests, are so important to our well-being, and that people have been living in these forests for hundreds of thousands of years. They're not unpopulated, empty spaces. And then next, I'm going to talk about the reasons why we've been losing so much forest over the past century. And I don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to quickly go through the two main reasons behind that and how that was kind of framed as modernization. And then a lot of the rest of the talk is all about how indigenous societies can actually teach us no longer indigenous. I read that phrase recently, and I really like it. No longer indigenous, because of course we were all once indigenous. And in England, there's lots of great historical examples of Celtic, not England, United Kingdom, of Celtic traditions. So yeah, this first part is going to just talk about why forests are so great. And obviously they're beautiful, you know that, and you can walk around the botanic forest and appreciate that, but they're much, much more. And I was lucky enough, my mom loved forests, and so she took us walking all the time. I try to drive my kids around as well. But I also very distinctly remember reading this book in primary school called The Great Kapok Tree. And it was just, I don't know, it stuck with me. And I really always had this fascination and passion for tropical forests. Basically, this logger goes into the forest and he wants to take down a big tree. It's probably a mahogany, it's kapok tree, right? It says it in the title, but it's one of these hardwood trees that's very valuable. And he gets tired because it's so big, so he falls asleep. And when he falls asleep, all these different animals, one by one, come and tell him why the tree is so important to the broader ecosystem and to them. And eventually a child from the Yanomami tribe also comes and tells that story. And at the end of this, he wakes up with new eyes, not seeing the forest as just a provider of products to be sold on the market, but as home to all of these creatures. And that's really the story that I want to tell today. So obviously, beginning with that childhood story, it's very focused on all of the amazing biodiversity from all over the world. We have, for example, the Western chimpanzee, which only exists in the upper Ghanaian forests of West Africa, great hornbill in India, the maned wolf, which is from a dry forest tropical ecosystem called the Cerrado in Brazil, sloths and jaguars from the Amazon. But also, there are many different types of socio-biodiversity, tens of thousands of indigenous people living in these areas. I've already mentioned the Yanomami, they're the biggest tribe in Brazil, in the Amazon, but all over the world. And not all of these people you would even call indigenous with a capital I today, but they are indigenous to place. They are also traditional. And sometimes the word indigenous, some people define as just people with effective local knowledge of the forest ecosystem. So in a sense, everybody can become indigenous again to the extent that they can understand and develop traditional ecological knowledge. For example, in Liberia, 95% of the population could be classified as indigenous, and is, because they're from that place, but none of them live in indigenous reserves. So it's a very complicated terminology. And the important thing here is that effective knowledge of place. And this knowledge is, one of the ways that this knowledge plays out is their understanding of forests' tremendous richness in terms of medicines and foods and other products. So quinine, for example, that's from a tree in the Amazon, so it's a very effective anti-malarial medicine. You obviously all probably know coffee very well. That goes more in the subtropics. Cocoa is native to the Amazon, make chocolate, but it's predominantly grown in West Africa now. We have acai, which is a superfood. It's got lots of iron. And rubber, which is historically was used to make things like tires, but now it's in the soles of our shoes. And these are made from raw rubber in the Amazon. And another thing that people don't know, because there's such a big focus on fossil fuels, which is the largest source of climate change, but after that, the largest bucket of emissions comes from land use. So predominantly through clearing forests, which hold a lot of carbon, and then also the agriculture that people do there. So to dive a little bit more into the details of all of that, it's actually a pretty stark picture. Over the last 2.5 decades, we've lost 75 million hectares of rainforest. And rainforest is this area you can see here in green. These are primary rainforests, like natural ecosystems that haven't been converted into non-native species. And all of these areas here in purple are places where that had really dense canopies and you know, so very complex forests that were cleared. So obviously it's not like wall-to-wall clearance here. That's the pixels kind of being over magnified. But when you sum that up all together, that's 75 million hectares. And I'll tell you what that means in a second. That means 2.5 times the size of the UK in terms of the magnitude of forests that have been lost in the last 25 years. So that's a huge amount. And when I say forest loss, we're talking about the complete clearance. So it goes from forest to, right now, this is a pre-land use kind of clearance, and this will eventually become soybean field in the Amazon. And then we also now have a lot of other types of deforestation happening through mining. Mining is a huge, huge problem now. This is for gold, and then fires. I'm gonna do questions at the end, Dave. Okay. So fires is a growing problem, especially with climate change. Remember it in your head, okay? So where is this happening the most? It's the biggest by far is in Brazil, which is why I'll be talking about that a lot. But this is the broader Amazon, Brazil #1, and then the Congo Basin, and we've got Indonesia across many islands. These are by far where the majority of the deforestation is happening globally. And the reasons for this, you've probably already heard about this, considering you guys are all science lovers. But a majority of all of the deforestation goes to food production. Over 72% of all of the deforestation is going directly into agriculture. And agriculture there includes also pastures for cattle ranching. And altogether of that cleared area, 70% of that agricultural product is not going towards fruits and vegetables or even things like beans or rice. It's going towards things that we eventually can feed to livestock, or it's going directly to pastures where we graze cattle. And that's all really problematic because the amount of meat that we're consuming has increased so rapidly. So the amount of land that we're allocating just to feed livestock has been growing, and it's a very inefficient use of the land. It's not really feeding as many people as it could because it's being fed to livestock. But the story I want to tell is one that people don't know about, which is that all of this was planned. We don't eat so much meat right now for no reason. We eat meat because the feed to produce it became so cheap. And it became so cheap because we developed the land into agriculture instead of other uses, and eventually created that demand. So this all was part of the larger colonization project in the Americas. And that started in the 1700s. And the reason that cattle has become so dominant across all of the Americas is because it was used as a really great way to spread over lots of area. So the cattle can take over all those areas and push out the indigenous people when there's not enough actual people from the colonizing group there. So it's a very effective strategy. That strategy has been followed pretty much nonstop in the Americas. And it became part of the actual national development paradigms in many countries throughout the world. And I'm just focusing on Brazil, but you can find this everywhere. You can find it in the United States as well. And so you see in the 1930s and 40s slogans like, the true sense of Brazilianness is the march to the West, which is this process of going from the coasts where everybody lived into the forests in the Brazilian Cerrado and Amazon. We had the same slogan in the United States. It was Manifest Destiny, and it's the same concept, march to the West, clear everything, develop it. You actually get land in both Brazil and the United States, same exact policy. You get right to land only if you cleared it, only if you developed it. And then into the 50s and 60s, this becomes more focused on national security. So they have this this slogan, entregar para não entregar, which means to secure it so that others can't enter. And in this sense, they're trying to spread over, especially the other borders of the Amazon, so that the other countries around there can't take the land. And until very recently, the place where I work a lot, and we'll be talking about in Acre, has shifted hands between Bolivia and Brazil, historically. So this is what it looks like. 80% of the areas that have been cleared, so 80% in total of the Amazon has been cleared, the Brazilian Amazon, and then 80% of that is in cattle. The rest is mostly in soybeans. So is that progress? Well, if you learn a little bit about cattle, which I've been studying for 15 years, maybe if you weren't an expert about it, you would see things like on TV. I just went down a deep rabbit hole watching the entire Yellowstone series, the 5 years of the Yellowstone series, and then there's also 1923 and 1883. All of it, it's fascinating to me to watch because this really embodies our obsession with cowboy culture and our kind of crazy stereotyping of cattle ranchers as being these like really elite, wealthy groups. And this is what people think cattle ranching is in the Amazon, but you would never, ever find this type of equipment. The only reason this guy has it is because he started getting into soybean production. So the reality of this is the myth, this is the vision, and people have studied this, anthropologists have studied this in the Amazon. It's really fascinating work. This is the reality. I've measured this in detail. It is the least profitable land use you can do. Like anything else you would do would be better. And people, it's really, really costly to try to repair the soil because it gets really degraded quickly because it's not nutrient rich to begin with. And as the vegetation grows up, as it gets weedy and woody, they just burn it again. And this is what a lot of the landscape looks like. Just roads and degraded cattle pastures. So, is this progress? I wouldn't say. Not what we've traded off. And a recent work that we've been doing is trying to shed light on something that nobody ever talks about, which is actually how this cattle system not only degrades the environment, but degrades women. And it taps into a much broader literature on ecofeminism that has shown this worldwide, that a lot of the same mentalities and cultures and practices that degrade nature also degrade women. And there's a lot of violence inherent in cattle ranching. Of course, you're constantly slaughtering animals. And so my former PhD student, she's now a postdoc, Leonie, she studied this in great detail. And, for the most part, women have zero agency. And the only way they can really take some agency is these tiny garden plots in their home where they develop alternative care economies, where they have their own sort of sets of social prestige and things like that, trading ornamental plants. And sometimes these could be very valuable if there were markets, but they're isolated and kept separate from each other. So it's a bit of a locked in system. And all of this is not just problematic for the people who live in the Amazon, but it's problematic to all of us from a food security perspective, because what scientists are finding a lot nowadays, they've documented this now, it's not just one study, it's like 5 studies now, that as you clear the Amazon, you create these conditions of drought because you're reducing what's called evapotranspiration, the flow of water from the trees into the atmosphere. And that dries out the area, leads to more fires, and then all of that creates more deforestation. But also it reduces the rainfall for crops elsewhere in South America. And so that's affecting this huge breadbasket that feeds the world. So the point of all of this is this existing system is in a system, it's called a positive feedback loop. And it's locking in all sorts of bad things that are no longer good for us, all started because of this broader colonization project. And we can't rely on quick fixes like paying somebody not to do something or trying to regulate and find every bad behavior. We need what's called transformative change. And so you'll see all over the world scientists are calling for transformation. No more incrementalism. It's not working. And what this means is fundamental changes in the structural, functional, relational, and cognitive, lots of jargon there, aspects of socio-technical ecological systems that lead to new patterns of interactions and outcomes. But what all of that means is that we have to transform the outer world and the inner world. So the cognitions and relational bits, those are our worldviews, our mindsets, and the outer transformation, that's our economies and our whole policy structures, right? So no more seeing forests as empty spaces or colonization projects, but seeing them for the value that they really have and seeing them in a totally different way. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. And I thought this was an interesting quote. When I was in high school going into college, I studied environmental science and I really worshipped these environmental lawyers who are at the forefront of all this litigation trying to get new policies passed. But this very famous environmentalist lawyer, Gustav Stef, after doing this for 30 years, he said, I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with that, we need spiritual and cultural transformation. And we lawyers and scientists don't know how to do that. The good news is there are many, many cultures that know how to do that. In fact, a majority of the world's cultures have other values than that. It's just the ones of us that have taken up too much space, particularly, I'm not going to go into it too much, but the whole sort of consumerist capitalist structure that we ourselves are sucked into has taken up a much too large space in what we can see as solutions. But there are many other alternatives. There's, as I said, hundreds, tens of thousands of indigenous groups. And when we talk about sustainability, think sustaining over hundreds of thousands of years, that's sustainability. And there are people in Africa who have been sustaining, like I said, the Mono people, for example, in Liberia for, over 100,000 years. And even you see then the migration patterns that led to establishment of different indigenous groups in Southeast Asia and Oceania, and then later in Central and South America. I don't know why this study didn't pick North America. But as I said, you see different designations here, indigenous community, but they're all people with effective local environmental knowledge, and they've been there a really long time. So heading back to the Amazon, this is what the soil originally looks like. It's a very, very old, ancient soil. It's acidic, it's got lots of metals, it's not good for growing crops. So what did indigenous people do? They burned a lot of stuff into to make biochar, and then they would bury that in the soil, and they would turn the soil into this rich black soil that was really good for agriculture. So in the places that they developed, which are these dark blue places, they made the soils different. Sorry, I'm standing in front of this. I probably, these dark blue places are all places where they changed the soils from this to this. It's quite incredible. So this is the terra preta, another example of their sustainability and how people understand it. Instead of clearing land, instead of clear cutting the land, just for this kind of crop production, they actually enriched the forests. They did that in a massive scale. I can see some of you have not heard of that, but a huge amount of the plant species in the Amazon were planted by people. Enriched, right? So they were native trees, but they made them much more common, much more predominant. 84% of all of the Amazonian, sorry, there's some other text I didn't see, but 84% of all the Amazonian trees, that individual trees, so that means not all species, but all the 84% of the trees themselves are useful to humans in the Amazon. Right? That just reflects how enriched they've been. So how long have I been talking? 20 minutes, perfect. So that's just some examples of the sustainable land use. But when we look to indigenous and traditional people, we can't just think about their land use, we have to think about their worldviews, their mindsets. And the biggest thing is what they can teach us about inner transformation. So a big focus in indigenous value systems is what's called relational values. That means they don't see like a separation between me and that tree as a subject and object distinction. They see it all as connected. So the value that exists is between us and between me and this whole place. It's not like a scientist would study and say, okay, I'm going to measure this and I'm going to know it and I'm going to discover the truth about it through experiments. It's a totally different way of seeing things. So, it's our relationship to the land itself that generates the processes, practices, and knowledges that inform our political systems and through which we practice solidarity. You see a lot of these kinds of quotes about how value systems are constructed in these societies. Very different. So one of the concepts that's really interesting, it's called kincentricity. And you will find this throughout all of the different, all of the different indigenous groups all over the world. It's that people and nature are seen as part of the extended family. So I don't know if you've ever heard of a sacred grove, but sacred groves once existed all over this country. You can't find them anymore, which is why I looked really hard to see if I could find a picture of one in England. So I chose like a mystical kind of interpretation, illustration of what a Celtic sacred grove will look like, because actually the Romans kind of plowed over them. And the ones that you see now have been recreated much later. But this is an actual sacred grove in India, and you can find them all over Africa. And places that have been heavily modified, you find that the sacred groves are the places that are still intact forests. And that's because that's where your ancestors are there. So you're communing with nature through, which is your ancestors through these forest areas. So when all of a sudden, when you start to see nature as your kin, as your family, so then how would you treat your family? How would you do things if your family is first, but everything is your family? It's quite a different way of looking at like me and my tiny family here versus the world. So there's a wholeness to all of it. There's a connection. And then the second major concept that I wanted you to take away was one of reciprocity. So everybody's kin, but the way that we make sure that things continue to exist is through the principle of reciprocity. It means that you cooperate, exchange in a balanced relationship. Without balance, things will not continue to exist. And I think we all might feel we lack that very much in our society, where sometimes it can be hard for neighbors to even get along. But in fact, studies have shown that most of us are conditional cooperators and altruistic punishers, that we want there to be a shared norm of reciprocity, and we will cooperate with others as long as we think they will cooperate with us. And we will punish people who disobey those norms. And actually, I would say that having moved to Europe from the United States, there is a much stronger sense of social norms in communities in England, and we also lived in Switzerland. where this is really quite strong. So we might overlook it, but it is a big part of our society, and I think it can be rekindled even more. And so reputation and things that we might discard and may have gotten off the rails, like gossip, for example. Gossip was a means of enforcing social norms. So just to give you an example, again, something that has sustained for for tens of thousands of years, are these traditional irrigation systems in Bali, Indonesia, where you have this, despite everywhere water being scarce and during, dry seasons and things like that, they still have this cooperative water use, this communal water infrastructure, no private property. And it's all guided by this kind of spiritual system where everybody takes their fair share, everybody works together, and it's kind of enforced through this kind of water temple, which is the spiritual administrative office for all of this. And so it's got this fairness, social reputation, all of that embedded in it. And again, Leonie, one of my PhD students, she and I did a systematic review of all the literature on culture and land use. And we found that in the places where sustainable land uses have sustained over time, it's where these pro-social motivations haven't been replaced by other Western value systems, like the global ones, the global one. And then the final concept I wanted you to leave with is that of care. Care is going to become a much bigger word, I think, in our global dialogue, because we have to bring back care. So just last year, I forget who it was that won the Nobel Prize, but it was an economist that focused entirely on care economics, and I can't remember the name now. But care economics is receiving a lot of attention these days because basically all of the care work in our economies has been undervalued. And the same, but in indigenous societies, in indigenous communities, care is actually a central value of those economies. And so that, what does that mean? Raising young, caring for the elderly, maintaining homes, sustaining communities and ecosystems. And you'll find examples all over the world. This one was from Aboriginal societies in Australia, where women, especially in these care roles that we've kind of invisibilized, have been crucial for monitoring wildlife, protecting endangered species, passing on knowledge, and collecting foods. Now, all of this may seem very niche, but I'm going to show you a few really kind of large examples that are really taking off in Brazil. In this, it's coming from the state of Acre, but just to say this is a huge push in the Brazilian Amazon right now. And in fact, the Amazonian indigenous grassroots movement took this terminology called socio-bioeconomies, and they're positioning it as a counter movement to a broader dialogue called bioeconomies. And they're trying to say, listen, if we're building new economies, let's build them around this socio-biocultural diversity. And let's build them around indigenous values. Focusing on contributing to nutrition, health, well-being, and climate resilience, not just economic value, not just profit. And they prioritize fair participation and market relations. And so there's lots of different great examples: agroforestry, fruit cultivation, plants and oils for cosmetics and medicines, sustainable management of fisheries. And I've seen successful examples like the HECA cooperative in Rondônia, Brazil, who really have these. So these are actually not indigenous communities. I guess that's a key point. These are migrants to the Amazon who have taken on and learned from the traditional knowledge to recreate cooperative societies that have this socio-biodiversity, care, solidarity at the center. And still embracing technology. Hazel, these are hearts of palm. This is what they look like. I know you love them. And kupuasu, which is a fruit. But so they're getting quite a lot of value out of it. And it's actually embedded into the whole state planning process. And so Rondônia is on the edge here. But there's other communities in Acre, the state of Acre, right next to Rondônia. All these ones in green are areas that the state is investing in as traditional land use. And these are not the indigenous reserves. These are the traditional the traditional peoples, which are in sustainable use reserves. So in summary, there's many sustainable cultures that can show us how to create economies that nurture both forests and societies. And if we embed all of this, it is a much better way to combat this eco-anxiety and despair, it's doom and gloom. But if we embrace an ethic of care, embrace connection and trust, we'll get better outcomes for people and nature. This is just a glimpse of what our research group looks like. It's very diverse. And it's a wonderful environment. Here's where we're all together at a conference in Mexico too. And if you're interested in this, there's lots of great books that you can read. And again, I hope you have used this talk, learned something new, and maybe we'll look at forests in a new way. So I just want to thank all the different people in my group whose work I've has contributed to this, as well as my collaborators in Indonesia and Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Brazil. Thanks a lot. I think I don't have another thank you slide, so that's the last slide.